So good morning. For those of you who don't know me, my name's Tony Baumert. I'm an environmental industry expert with Ollson. Ollson is a nationally recognized engineering and design firm, founded in 1956 right here in Nebraska, with the mindset to improve communities by making them more sustainable, better connected, and more efficient. And I really think it's those tenets that align pretty well with the goals and the ambitions of wind energy in Nebraska. So we're very happy to be a part of this conference every year. So thanks for the opportunity. And now it is my distinct pleasure today to introduce Chris Olsson. He clearly spells his last name incorrectly. Chris holds his doctorate in environmental health. Over the past 25 years, Chris has tackled some of North America's most controversial environmental issues in the energy sector related to oil and gas, power generation, and most recently wind energy and solar development, routinely testifying before various governing bodies across the United States, including here in Nebraska. Chris is also a veteran of the Canadian Navy. I didn't know that, Chris. And holds an adjunct professorship at the University of Toronto. And so without further ado, I will welcome Chris Olsson to the stage. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Tony. And yeah, I do spell my name wrong. It causes confusion amongst clients. Sometimes they send the invoice or the checks to the wrong spot. But so good morning, folks. Do we have the presentation? Usually when I show up, something's going not so right with David in the counties. And usually I'm the one called in to deal with the health impacts. When John was mentioning yesterday that, you have to react to the screaming child, I'm the one they're usually screaming at. So I'm just going to take you through briefly some of the health challenges and what communities face and what they're looking at when they're looking at Facebook, when projects are coming in, when they're new. I'll respectfully disagree with Mike. Iowa is just as bad as it is here in terms of opposition. I mean, whether you've got 2 years or you've got 50 years of experience in the renewable game, if you're out in California, there are still, challenges. I could just as easily be giving this talk in any one of the states, any one of the 50 states, because they all face the same challenges. And really, I started my career, and I still do in my career, a lot of what I do is environmental health work in terms of air quality risk assessment. You want to build a pipeline, you want to build Canada's oil sand, you want to do something with an incinerator. That's a lot of what I do. I call that my full-time job. And then all of a sudden, about 12 years ago, I got a phone call saying, hey, we need a health section on a wind project, and I need it in 72 hours. And I said, Peter, you got to stop drinking at your desk. It's only 11 in the morning. What do you, health, wind turbine, what? And as you all know, this has become quite the topic over the last decade or so. So we're going to go through that. I've testified at a number of hearings, as Tony has said, a number of Senate committees. If you type my name into Google, you'll see that Senator Mike Thompson in Kansas does not enjoy my company very much when I testified there last year opposing bills that he was trying to put in place. Because I think we do need proper siting and guidance for wind projects, for solar projects, for battery storage. We'll talk a little bit about each of those as we go here. These are just some of the peer-reviewed papers that I and some of my colleagues have published in the field. So what are we going to talk? I'm going to spend most of my time on wind today because it tends to be the more controversial. You've all heard about wind turbine syndrome, coined by Dr. Nina Pierpont out of New York around 2008. She talked to 15 people. They told her they felt bad living around wind turbines. All of a sudden, we have a syndrome. Okay, and we've been dealing with this for the last 15 years or so, trying to combat misinformation, perceptions on the internet, and the like. People want to talk about audible noise, low frequency noise, the boogeyman of infrasound that's always brought up in the room, shadow flicker, blade failure, tower collapse, fire. The whole world's going to come to an end if you bring a wind project near me. We'll talk about how we actually then interact with county commissioners, with planning and zoning, to try to bring that science to bear, to try to give them that, not only the science, but I also say the cover, because they have 40 yelling, screaming people in their meetings in a county that may have 10, 15, 20,000 people, but 40 people show up who've never showed up to a planning and zoning meeting. If you're go to a planning and zoning meeting when you're not developing a project. Just wander into any Nebraska planning and zoning meeting if you're not trying to develop a project. There's nothing else on the agenda other than the roads. I want to sever off 5 acres for my grandson. There's 2 people in that room, right? If you then have a project, you may have 50, you may have 100, you may have 200. We'll talk a little bit about solar and battery storage as well. So wind, as you all know, there's over 70,000 turbines across the U.S., vast majority on rural and cropland. They are both in sparsely. If you're coming to Nebraska, for the most part, you'd be in a more sparsely dense population in rural Nebraska. That being said, as developers have tried to come into Lincoln Lancaster, and then I get we have more people living in Lancaster County than anywhere else, that's too densely populated, we can't do it. Well, come to New York where we have projects where there are 1,000 homes within a mile of a turbine, right? And when we're developing these projects and we're looking at health risks and benefits, we are looking at individual families and homes. So I don't care if there's one home within the project area. I've got projects in Nebraska where I think we've got 30 homes within a mile of a turbine. So whether you have 30 homes or you have 300 homes or you have 1,000 homes, we are looking at protection of everybody. I don't need to do this. All right, so, I'm in a room, I would assume, of mostly converts. Everybody loves renewable energy. As David said, spent a lot of time with David in counties in Nebraska. His daughter doesn't understand why people don't want renewable energy. Well, if you take a poll, 84% of respondents in the U.S. said, yes, we want more renewable energy. But when you get down to the local level, that is a fairly similar number. I've seen polling done in counties where people will say, oh, we don't want the wind project. It's a very controversial project. And yet if you do polling in those, you see some of the developers doing polling in those counties, you still see 70, 80% of the people in the county favor a project moving forward. It's the 40 or 50 people that you have to deal with. The opposition's been growing. I first time I came to Nebraska was 2014, I believe, working on the Cottonwood project. And that was about the time in the US where things started shifting, right? Where it used to be North Dakota, South Dakota, here in Nebraska, you wanted to put a project up, you went and met some landowners, you signed up property, you went to the planning and zoning, you got that signed off, you went to county commission, that got signed off, and 6 months later you were building a project. Almost universally across the US right now, regardless of what state you go into, that is no longer the case anymore. As you all know, it takes sometimes a year, 2 years to get through the permitting process, if you can get through it at all. If they don't enact, like Gage County did, a 1 mile setback. I think it was Mike that was saying, just don't be putting in these silly setbacks. Just say we don't want wind. If you don't want wind, that's fine. But going through 6 months, a year for poor planning and zoning people, county commissioners to do this it gets a little much. So again, here are the things that we're worried about. So we'll go through these. Noise can be a problem. Okay, environmental noise. The reason we have regulations, typically in Nebraska, it's 50 decibels. Some counties you get to 45. You go much below 45, it becomes problematic for installing a project. But noise can cause health issues. So that's why we do have to have regulations. So where do we get the information? Where does the science come from? Not just because I'm from Canada, okay? It's Health Canada conducted the largest study around the world anywhere back in 2014, surveying over 1,200 landowners living around projects that had either been operational for a year or up to 10 years. Did a very detailed, most comprehensive health study in the world, including doing things like taking blood pressure measurements, sleep studies, taking hair cortisol for those of them that had hair in order to measure stress levels. We were doing all of this work because we had the same challenges we face in Nebraska. People were coming out in droves. We had public meetings where there'd be 2,000 people literally in the parking lot with manure spreaders and hanging effigies of our premier, basically the equivalent to the governor. And so the Health Canada said, okay, well, we got to study this. Ultimately, what they found was there isn't evidence. When you look at levels of up to sort of 46, 50 decibels, there isn't sleep disturbance when you do the studies properly. There is no increased stress levels amongst those population. There's not the hearing, concerns. There's not the migraines. All of the things that you hear commonly within your public meetings, they just are not actually true. So all the stuff they're reading on the internet or they say that they've heard online, turns out it's not true. Once you get through the audible noise side, we want the sound level to be 40 decibels or 35. And there's a handful of experts in the US, so-called experts, that will come and testify and tell communities, 35 decibels, 2 miles, that's the only way you can have a safe wind turbine setback distance. They have PhDs, some of them are acousticians, and they create havoc. There's a physician up in Iowa right now named Ben Johnson. Dr. Johnson's a cardiologist. He's retired at this point, but who do you want to believe? Your friendly doctor who's the cardiologist in the group, or some guy named Chris Olsson from Canada? It becomes tricky. What does a community want to believe and know? So then we get to low frequency noise and infrasound. And in the past, I've had developers say, oh yeah, there's no low frequency noise or infrasound coming from turbines. There is. There's low frequency noise and infrasound in this room right now. okay? We're actually subjected to about the same level of low frequency noise and infrasound in the room right now as you would be about 300-400 feet from a turbine. Yes, it's out there, it exists, but it's not an issue, and we'll see why. So this is a what is he doing throwing a slide like this up, and I didn't think we'd have to do science today, but this is a German study where the German government went out and measured, this is 300 meters, so about 1,000 feet from a turbine, 960 feet, give or take, from a turbine, where they're measuring low frequency sound and infrasound. Simply, infrasound's anything less than 20 hertz, low frequency, and you can't hear it. 20 hertz and above is low frequency noise till you get to about 200, then we get into that dBA audible sound stuff. What this is the pink band here is measurements of low frequency noise and infrasound from a turbine at about 1,000 feet. What you see here on the green line, that's the turbine shut off, same wind speed and everything else. That's the wind, low frequency noise and infrasound. For all of you who drove over this morning who live in Lincoln or nearby, that's the amount of infrasound and low frequency noise you were getting driving in your car. All right? So when we communicate this to the public, we talk to county commissioners, yeah, of course these things happen, but we're so far below levels that we're used to every given day. This is not a health concern. So as we kind of keep going here, again, so there's lots of studies, we talk about the studies, you've all had to deal with shadow flicker. Now, candidly, in the past, you can get some great videos online from 2010, 2011, 2012 YouTube, where there's shadow flicker going for hours and hours in somebody's home. That typically tends to be houses that were built in Illinois, where we'd put 5 turbines 1,000 feet to the east and 5 turbines to the west. And all day and night, or all morning and all evening, during sunrise and sunset, we had homes that were having hundreds of hours of shadow flicker a year. It's not a health concern, but there has to be some sort of reasonable test as to what actually constitutes, the reasonable amount of shadow flicker. The health concern that originally was brought up was, and you hear it still today, I have epilepsy, my son has epilepsy, my daughter has epilepsy, I'm worried about seizures from shadow flicker. Simply the turbines, it's photosensitive epilepsy. It's those Japanese cartoons that we had back in around the early 2000s where they were flashing really crazy on the TV and some kids were actually seizuring. That's because the flash frequency rate's too high. Turbines quite simply don't spin fast enough to elicit that seizure reaction. We've got some really good research out of the UK on that. But I do believe, even though there's a new paper that was published here in the US, most of the research on the health and annoyance side of wind turbines and renewables is done by the Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory, headed up by Ben Hone. Research is paid by the DOE, and they've just published a shadow flicker paper on survey and respondents in the US. Essentially, you cannot link the amount of annoyance of shadow flicker to the actual your annoyance to the actual number of minutes, hours, etc. these days. Basically, if you don't like the turbines, the same is true for noise. There actually isn't a link to the annoyance and the noise level. It's if you don't like the turbines, you didn't want the project in the first place, and you don't want to look at them, that's what causes people to believe that they have health issues living around wind turbines. I don't say that lightly or flippantly. It's a real phenomenon. It's you self-ascribe, I don't like the turbine, I don't like the noise, I don't like the shadow flicker. It turns out it's I don't want the project. I'm worried about property values, right? And David said, well, cancer on Facebook. It wasn't cancer on Facebook. It was former President Trump the night before a 4-day hearing that I had in Reno County, Kansas, that got on TV and told everybody wind turbines cause cancer. The woo-woo, and he did that, and they cause cancer. What do you think I dealt with for 4 days in Reno County, Kansas after that, and still do? President Trump says wind turbines cause cancer. Who are you to say they don't? Well, okay, let's talk about it. How do we talk about it? And it's trying to bring that science to bear. So there does need to be some shadow flicker regulations. Most of the Nebraska counties don't actually have a regulation. Those that do and those that we've worked with tends to be no more than 30 hours a year of actual shadow flicker. And is that needed for a health perspective? No, but it's just a reasonable test, right? The other thing I want to emphasize, shadow flicker does not occur outside. It's shadows from the turbine. For any of you that have experienced, put your hand up if you've experienced shadow flicker inside a home from a turbine. Yeah, I've got like a Rich Lampeter over here who's the noise and shadow flicker guy's got his hand. Okay, so think about this. You got a room full of developers and everything else, and hardly anybody, and consultants, and hardly anybody's actually experienced this. Yet we get up and we tell people 30 hours is going to be fine. I would encourage you, if you're in the development community, to actually go spend some time in somebody's home where you get the noise, you get the shadow flicker, so you can see that experience. So outside, though, shadow flicker is not a thing. It's a lazy shadow on the ground. In fact, the cows actually like to follow the turbines and the towers around in the shade in the winter or in the summertime to keep them cool. But don't get, a lot of counties want to try to, if they're doing this sort of, or zoning wind out, what they'll often try to do is zero shadow flicker at the property boundary or at the property line. That's not obtainable. For your projects, you can't possibly build to that. Let's shift very quickly here to public safety. When bad things happen to turbines. This just happens to be a GE manual that's probably the only publicly available document on siting from any of the O&Ms. So I'm not here to endorse GE. What I'm saying, this is a publicly available document. And this says, essentially be 1.1 times tip height back from various features. Ice throw. We get this all the time in Nebraska. We get icing conditions in Nebraska. Ice throw. Ice is going to fling off the turbines. It's going to hit my house. It's going to hit my barn. It's going to hit me when I'm on the snowmobile. It's ice throw bad. Well, it turns out that after the research that has been done, what this little circle is, this is the turbine in the middle. This was a study in Norway where they actually iced up the turbine, gave it all sorts of different, a pink color to the ice so that they could see where it was falling later. They turned the turbine on. We get ice throw from the turbine. And this is basically the circle here is the distance of the tip height of the turbine from the turbine. And you'll see the ice falls within the tip height of the turbine. This is true of small turbines. This is true of large turbines. So putting an appropriate setback to a neighboring property line of 1.1 times tip height ensures the ice stays within the property. I come from a long line of dairy farmers. As my grandfather used to just tease the heck out of me, no farmer stands in his field in the middle of winter during icing conditions, right? You just don't. It's just not happening. So we haven't seen anybody actually hit and struck and damaged by ice throw over the years. Blade fragment throw. This is a study out of the UK where this is your risk of getting, if you were present near a turbine and you had blade fragments thrown from the turbine, it happens, they deteriorate, you can get fragments thrown. Your chance of actually getting hit by a blade in the vicinity is about 1 in 10 billion chance. You have a better chance of being struck by lightning. And for all of you who flew over to Lincoln in the last few days, you've got the same chance of your flight here and back falling out of the sky and dying as you would be getting hit by a blade. The risk is so remote. And again, it falls within tip height. Tower collapse, towers when they do fail. Again, all of these are very rare events, we like to say. The number of times I've heard people say, this never happens to county commissioners. And then 2 days later, a fire catches or a blade collapse or tower collapses in the county next door. They do happen. It is rare. But the good thing is when they happen, again, towers collapse on themselves within tip height. So an appropriate regulation would be within the tip height. Fires, again, they're great dramatic YouTube videos of the fires. You've all seen them. If you haven't, I happened to be at a fire at a turbine in Ontario just because it was about 10 miles down the road from my house when it caught. I knew the developer. They said, come on over, we're having a fire, so you can actually see it firsthand. I mean, this is scary things for the community. They see these YouTube videos of fire. Well, again, you all know that we don't fight the fires. You have the local county fire department often volunteer. You ask them to set a perimeter around the fire. They burn themselves out. People and property do not get damaged by these things. It's a way to communicate to commissions, to people. I don't think you're ever going to convince the people who come, who've read the Facebook pages, who are there in opposition, the 40 to 100 people that show up at your county meeting. I'm happy to speak to those people. I always say, find the people who hate you the most, speak to them first, right? Try to get that dialogue going. No matter what I say, or anybody says, they're not going to be convinced. What you're trying to do is give that evidence to planning and zoning folks and to the county commissioners to allow them to realize you don't need a 1 mile setback. You don't need to go crazy here. We all hear livestock hunting issues. I've shot a 10-point buck at 40 yards from a turbine where I had my ground blind at the back of the turbine. Why did I do that? Well, A, enjoy hunting, but B, so that I could say that I shot a 10-point buck. It happened to be a nice buck. Sitting at a ground blind at the base of a turbine. Turbines can, when you do construction, like any construction activity, you might have wildlife scatter out a little bit. You might have the deer and that, they don't want to go right beside the crane and that, but they come back very quickly into the area. We do not have widespread reporting of hunting issues like you often hear, well, my cattle are going to suffer. My dairy cows, Nebraska, not so much the dairy cows. The cattle are going to, suffer. I'm not going to be able to, the stock's going to do that. We do have studies that demonstrate, not a lot, but demonstrate. But why do we know that this is compatible? 70,000 turbines, mostly in crop and pasture land across the U.S. tell you, if the Texas beef producers who have all of their turbines on their property, if there was an issue with turbines and livestock, you'd know about it by now. So long story short, on the wind side, what do I recommend? So often when we go to county commissions, planning and zoning, I'll prepare sort of a 15-page overview document for them. I'd say 90% of the time they've probably never read it. It's okay, but it gives them something to have that has material facts in it that countermands what the opposition's bringing. I do believe you have to have proper sound levels, and those are somewhere between 45 and 50 decibels. You know, and I know for some of the developers in the room, you're freaking out saying, oh God, he said 45 decibels, it should be 50. You can build projects to 45 decibels, you can build them to 50. The vast majority of turbines, the 1,400 turbines here in Nebraska that are up and spinning, have been operating at a 50 decibel sound limit for 10, 15 years. It works. The health sciences support it. You're not gonna have sleep disturbance, you're not gonna have anything else. If you go much below 45, first of all, there's no reason to go below 50 or 45 decibels from a health perspective. And you all know that if we go beyond that, sort of lower than that, if we get to this opposition, we want 35 decibels, we want 30, you're not building your projects. And there's no need to do that to support for the health and the science. Again, no more than 30 hours of shadow flicker. Setback distances are a tricky one. 1.1 times tip height is pretty much if you set that back from property lines, set that back from roads, transmission lines and the like, you're good to go. People want to say, well, how far do I have to be to the home? Give or take, it's your noise study that's going to dictate that anyway for the most part. But, you know, somewhere in that neighborhood of a quarter mile or, you know, as turbines get taller, I often tell county commissions, don't set a fixed setback distance anymore, because we all know we went from 400-foot turbines to 450-foot turbines to 500, and then we all promised counties that we wouldn't be going above 500, and then next day we went to 600, now we're at 650, almost 700 feet. If commissions set it, and if you're going in and you're working with your county commissioners to set a new set of regulations or they're opening it up, I often say do it on a multiplier of the tip height, because then they don't have to go back and fix it the next day. They don't have to then, you know, the public says, well, they're going to build a 650-foot turbine, not a 500. We need to fix the setback distance. So some reasonable multiplier, 2.5 times tip height sets you back nicely. And, you know, that's kind of what we're looking at and recommend. And again, all of this to say for the turbines, we know that they're compatible with local rural communities. When people come to the meetings and they're upset, often they'll bring health as the issue, but that's not really the underlying issue. The underlying issue is property values. It's the don't want to look at them. I've moved to rural Nebraska, I've got my 5 acres, and I've moved here because I wanted to get out of the city. You've all heard that time and again. That's a fair point. But we can't, just because you don't want to look at something. And somebody said yesterday, you know, they bought their 5 acres and they think they have the full 10,000 acres ahead of them in viewshed, that they own it all. We all want to believe that that's the case, but it's not. So you got to come up with reasonable regulations in order to help the county commissioners put projects through, put people in front, just like you do with your wildlife biologists, and that have somebody come and work with the county commission who's credible, who can, you know, speak to the issues. So I'll quickly tackle solar and battery storage. I used to say, you know, after I got through the whole shock of now I, you know, spent 12 years doing research on wind turbines and health and the like, and been all over the world doing this, I always said, okay, if somebody calls me for a solar project, I quit. I'm just done. There can't be a health problem with solar. For all of you now, you know, like we're getting, solar's just going crazy in the US right now, right? Went wind crazy for a bit. Now we've got solar coming up here, there, and everywhere. I've worked on a number of solar projects as well over the last decade. The fear tends to be EMF, electromagnetic fields coming from perceived EMF problems coming from solar panels, that they're going to cause leukemia in your kids next door. It's not the case. It's not true. In fact, you get, you know, a couple of feet away from the panels or the inverters, you're back to background on EMF. In fact, you could live right underneath a solar panel if you wanted. Just like you can live right underneath a 345 kV line. We don't have people living right on them, but we have them 100 feet, 200 feet from lines, right? It is safe to do so. The other thing that you hear a lot is well, they're filled with heavy metals. And those heavy metals are going to leach into the ground, then they're going to get into the groundwater, then they're going to get into my well. Yes, there are metals in solar panels, okay? But as you all know, unless you break them up, you put them in some hydrochloric acid, and then you sit around for a couple hours, you're not getting metals leaching from those panels. Disposal is a whole other issue. I don't tackle that. That's for somebody else to deal with. But putting solar anywhere in a community from a health perspective, you do not need setbacks. And you're now seeing more and more opposition coming up with, we need a 1 mile setback from solar panels in order to ensure the children's health. It's not the case. There literally is, when people call me and ask about definitely wind turbine setbacks like solar, you could literally put them right beside the person's house. Now, I know you have other solar challenges that you've got siting regulations that you deal with, but from a health perspective, you don't need to do that. Battery storage, as you all know, and certainly the developers in the room, everybody wants battery storage now, right? And really this has taken off a lot in New York State. There's been a lot of battery storage projects move forward in New York. New York City itself has put a massive battery storage facility on a former coal-fired generating station. All right, so these are not just the small little shipping containers anymore. For those of you who are in the development side, we're talking about warehouse buildings now, where you might have an integrated 300 megawatt wind project with 100 megawatts of solar, and you're going to build a 400 megawatt battery storage facility in a warehouse on the property. And often what you'll see now is people are designing those looking like barns, no kidding, like so that it kind of blends in to the community instead of putting up a Costco-like store in the middle of rural America. There are a lot of, the conspiracy theories over batteries and health are just unbelievable. They're even more crazy than some of the wind stuff that you hear. That you're going to have drone attacks from the Russians that will knock them out and blow up communities. If the battery storage facility catches fire, it will blow up. It will be a larger detonation than Hiroshima. These are the things you hear. So what is the truth, right? First of all, this technology has been in place for years. Where the misinformation tends to come from, there was a battery storage fire in Arizona a couple of years ago now. Unfortunately, it was in a sealed sea crate container, similar to what you have up here, but that it was actually not designed properly. We'll see some pictures later. But sealed up, the firemen went to open the container, and there was a bit of backdraft blowback, okay? Properly designed containers, properly designed storage facilities do not have that. They have been co-located in cities for years. If they catch fire, because again, we don't want to use these things never happen. They do, it's rare. But if they catch fire, it's essentially like having a plastics fire. It is sort of the equivalent. And so there's for all of you who are familiar with DNVGL, they actually got a bunch of batteries and they burned them. And they tested these facilities, which is a good thing to figure out what's going on. Okay, and if there's anybody from DNV in the audience, great report. You worked with your folks on this when they were doing it. At the end of the day, firefighters don't need specialized equipment. Water puts out these fires, there's nothing else that they need. They do need training, right? If you're gonna put in these facilities, just like you train on a wind project or the like with EMS, and away you go. So ultimately, if you do have questions coming up as county commissioners or in planning and zoning, how far back do we have to be from battery fires? Or sorry, for battery facilities? How far back do you wanna make somebody go from your barn? Okay, barns catch fire. It's a horrible thing when it does, but when they catch fire, they have to be put out. If they're not put, there's a perimeter set. As any of you have been to a barn fire, the firefighters are not going to sit there and try to fight that fire all day long. It's almost impossible to do. They set a perimeter, making sure the house doesn't go up. They making sure the house doesn't up. And it's similar to these types of fires as well. Similar to a wind turbine fire. Now, would you maybe have to evacuate the neighbors who are, a couple doors over because the smoke's blowing in their direction? Not from a health perspective necessarily, but that's a prudent thing to do, right? And so these are the types of discussions that we have. Overall, I've got 20-year history. I know that was like 2 little turbines or something 20 years ago. It's really 15-year history in Nebraska, but you have proper siting that's already in place in Nebraska. And I think as you go to county commissions and we work with county commissioners and planning and zoning folks, it's not just, Health Canada says this and everything else. It fundamentally comes down to, we've got projects that have been up and operating for at least 15 years in Nebraska. They're operated properly. Have we had a blade fail in Nebraska? Sure we have. Was anybody hurt? No, they weren't. Has a tower ever collapsed? Yes, it has. Nobody was hurt. That's because your siting guidelines you already have in place are appropriate. And with that, I think that's all I've got, Tony, for the presentation.
Thank you, Dr. Olsson. Uncomfortable questions, maybe? So you talked about the health consequences of renewables. Do you spend any time in your conversations with local officials or decision makers about the health consequences of what the renewables might replace?
Yeah, and certainly that is a topic that comes up quite often, right? And in fact, in risk communication and the work that we do, we try to avoid when we're having that conversation, well, it's going to replace the coal plant and that improves air quality. I mean, those are all studies that we've done, improves air quality for the community. Everything. The problem is the coal plant's not usually in that community, right? So what I often will tell people is that, yeah, we can have that conversation that, this is better for the planet and, reduction of greenhouse gases, takes coal plants off, some of that. But ultimately, the community doesn't particularly care usually because that's not what's in their community. So often I say, yeah, absolutely, it's part of the mix, but it's better just to deal head on with the technology that's put in front of them.
Separate question, if I may. So it was not all that long ago that a state law passed establishing county health departments. And environmental health is typically something that they do, but that environmental health is swimming pools, restaurants.
Gonorrhea.
Yeah, all that. So I appreciate you coming to Nebraska, but I struggle trying to find some expertise in Nebraska, and I don't know whether I'm not finding it because it's not there, or do you have a comment about that?
Yeah, so certainly one of the first things I do in Nebraska after the Cottonwood project is actually working with the Lincoln-Lancaster County Health Department. And, quite candidly, they back in, I believe it was around 2015, 2016, they pushed forward, the county health department pushed forward a series of regulations through the county. I believe the sound level was 35 or 38 decibels, setback distances that were too extreme. And it caused a lot of havoc here in Nebraska because, well, the county health department said, so therefore it must be true. I mean, this is not, I enjoy the company of the folks over at the county health department. And, I'd say it if they were in the room, maybe they are. At the end of the day, no, you're not going to find that expertise in Nebraska, and nor do you find it hardly anywhere else. And there's about 4 or 5 of us across the country that actually do this work. There's a couple of physicians and another epidemiologist. And it is challenging because, sometimes we're not available. There's, double booked, whatever have you. And it is challenging. So when you're talking to somebody in Nebraska, well, where are Nebraska health studies? You don't have Nebraska health studies because you haven't spent the $5 million to do it here in Nebraska. So then you point to other groups, other credible medical agencies. So for example, the Ohio Department of Health in April of this year just released a series of documents on solar, wind, and battery storage reviewing health effects. So you can bring those to bear and start to bring them. But in terms of Nebraska expertise, you're probably not going to find it. And this is not an egotistical thing. There's 4 or 5 of us that sort of end up spending our time around the country doing this because it's a little bit more complex than some of the others.
You talked a lot about the challenges you have communicating accurate science. I was wondering if you could talk about if you found any successful communication techniques. Is there anything that you can say that does get through to people at these hearings?
Yeah, certainly, this is the longest I get to talk in Nebraska ever. Usually I'm one of those people who gets the 3 minutes, I go to the county, just like it, because they don't want to play favorites. So, I get up for the developers, I spend 3 minutes, I get my time shut off. But then usually what happens is that I spend half hour, 45 minutes, an hour, 2 hours at the microphone talking through with commissions. In terms of effective communication, really there's 2 audiences. And there is actually really 3 audiences, I would say. There's the people who come to the meetings, let's say not an open house or whatever for a developer, or they come to a planning commission meeting because they've heard there's a project, they're not quite sure, they're on the fence. Those people you can actually communicate with. You can actually have, one-on-one conversations, often reaching out, kitchen table conversations. You can do it at the public meetings and have a reasonable conversation. It is bringing some of the stuff that I've got up here today, but bringing it in a format that everybody can kind of appreciate. Then there's the angry mob side that you're not going to get through. And what I say with that group is that you communicate, you talk directly to them, but don't think you're ever going to convince them of anything. And then really what we're, a lot of the time, that I spend is, certainly with the, young mother and father with the autistic child who, they're concerned. Those are good communications. But it really is trying to talk to planning and zoning and county commissions. What we'll often do is submit sort of a 15-page plain language sort of overview, giving them the cover that here is what the science says. And then when we're at the meetings, we can refer, well, Commissioner, if you go to page 3. And then it's just there that it's in writing. It looks, it's something that they can have and hold. But ultimately, it's just, having these plain discussions with commissioners. It's a complex subject. You cannot spend 45 minutes talking about the ins and outs of the details of statistics and everything else. It's just bringing to them, here's what we found. This is what we see. And just really just talking to the language that you need to in development.
Do you have any stories or other comments on solar construction noise, specifically from the pile drivers?
I mean, certainly during construction, with any construction project, it can be challenging, right? And it's short-term, short-lived, and it is not fun for communities at times, right? As long as I think in a construction phase that you're open with the community about what's going to happen, then the community's forewarned. If you're not open with the community that you're going to get into construction noise, you're going to have, my favorite is when developers say that, oh, we won't do nighttime construction. And then the next thing you know, they're out there at 4 a.m. with the lights going, cranes are operating and everything else. My thing is always just be upfront with the communities that you're working in. Let them know this is, pile driving for solar farms is not going to be fun for a couple days. And, especially if you're a shift worker and you're trying to sleep during the day when that's happening. So, I think with solar and with any project in construction, just being upfront as to what the community is going to experience.
You mentioned the thing of property value. Have you looked into that at all? Because that's an issue that people often bring up. Or is that somebody else's job?
Yeah, so I can tell you that I think I'm an expert in everything because I've been to so many county hearings and state level hearings. Rich Lampeter over here is the acustician. I often work with one of them. I could tell you all about his job. I could tell you about Tony's job and birds and bats, and I could tell you about everything. But no, I mean, I can tell you there have been a lot of property studies done. I'm not the person to speak to them. If there's anybody in the room, David Levy, who actually was up here, one of the lawyers, you can speak with him after, or maybe if he's still in the room, he could comment. But no, I'm not the guy to actually, I know the studies have been done, but I'm not the right guy.
The Berkeley lab has done the most recent study on land values. So that's a good place to go and look because they've, looked across the country to see how that works. Peter Goldberg, that was at this conference some years ago, was a auditory engineer, and he was very good at being able to take normal situations that people live in and the level of noise that they were hearing and trying to put our everyday lives in some sort of kind of contrast with the amount of noise that was coming from wind projects, for example. Do you do that? Is that helpful?
Absolutely. It's definitely one of the first tricks and tools we do. So if I stop talking for a second here, sound level, I've got the little, everybody's got their iPhone and their app, but I've got, they're actually fairly accurate these days. I mean, you can't do compliance measurements with them. But the sound in this room right now is 50 decibels without me speaking. About 48 to about 52 without me talking. While I'm talking, it's about 70. So we do the, often what we'll be in is community hall, whatever the fans are going and the like. And it's usually about the 50, even when it's really quiet, it's about 50 decibels. So we'll have to do that. We talk about, if you're standing beside your tractor when it's running, that's about 100 decibels. If you're near the grain dryer, that's going to be over 100 decibels, right? Standing near it, you don't want to be. And then you always get into a debate. Well, I live in rural Nebraska. It is you could hear a pin drop in the middle of summer. Well, no. Rural Nebraska, and Rich is, again, I'll just be the expert in everything today. But, you do have rural Nebraska. You're going to be somewhere in the 30s up to the 50s in rural Nebraska at nighttime when it's quiet. People think that their quiet means it's zero, and it's not. And so we often try to work with, other sources of noise, give them an appreciation for what it sounds like. The one thing that I don't like, and if any of you have ever said it's going to be as quiet as your refrigerator, stop using that reference. Your refrigerators these days are very quiet. They're not like the old refrigerators. If I hear one more developer tell the community it's going to be the sound of your refrigerator, I'm going to stick you under a turbine and make you stand there for 2 hours in penance because they're not, right? So, but as you say, John, you have to find rural noise that people are used to. And, if I say, well, it's the same thing as being, downtown Lincoln here in the middle of the night, I don't live in downtown Lincoln, I live out here. So it is bringing those noise sources that we're familiar with. What does a combine sound like, in the field 4 fields over at nighttime? So it's kind of working with communities to understand that, but absolutely.
Lancaster County's sound regulations are based upon the subjective idea of annoyance. Is there any way of getting rid of that particular idea in a regulation?
Yeah, absolutely. Annoyance really is the one we deal with kind of at the end of the day. And what we did see over the last couple of years, we worked with Lancaster County again. They changed their noise regulations. I believe it's 42 decibels now at nighttime, up from the 38 or 35 there was. And it's working. So what the gentleman's referring to is this concept of annoyance. And when we study sound sources, whether it's wind turbines, whether it's roadways, there's an ISO standard for setting how do we talk to people about annoyance? And on a scale of 1 to 5, you're asked a questionnaire, how annoyed have you been with the wind turbine noise over the last year? And you check 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5. And what we see is that there is a higher prevalence of annoyance, give or take somewhere between 15 and 20% of people will report being highly annoyed living around turbines. Well, in the acoustic health world, when we see an elevated level of annoyance like that, that can be a primary indicator of things like secondary downstream stress, heart issues, and everything else. So we study it further. And that's what Health Canada did. That's what LBNL Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory has done. That's what the Australians have done. So we take that annoyance issue, and it turns out, again, just like I was saying with shadow flicker, the annoyance, only about 10% of that reported 1 to 5. I'm annoyed, this year with turbines. For those who check 5, when you do all the other questions in that survey, it turns out it has very little to do with the noise level. And it's all about things like property value and what we call visual cue and attitude. And again, not to make light of it, but if you don't like the project, you didn't want the project, and you don't like looking out your door at it, that's what's really driving the annoyance. It's actually not the sound level at all. So it's not really correlated to sound. So whether you've got 50 decibels, 40 decibels, or 35 decibels, if you look out your window and you don't like seeing the 5 turbines out your window and you live a mile, 2 miles away, you'll report just as much annoyance as somebody living right underneath them. So it is that's one where we, again, there's a number of ways that we communicate with public if they bring that up and county commissions. It's often something that we do face with health departments. And again, in fairness to the Lincoln Lancaster Health Department, back when that regulation was first set was 2015, before the publications, the real publications on the science had come out from around the world. And that's why I think they were, when that regulation changed a year and a half ago or so, coming up to 42 decibels, which is a little bit more reasonable, was because we were able to have that conversation.
So thanks for being a great audience, and let's thank Chris
Thanks, everybody.
before we head into the break.